really extraordinary introduction. We are South Carolina girls, although I'm of a different generation. Her mother and aunt were in my high school, I think just a little bit ahead of me. But at any rate, and thank you also to the conference organizers, especially Chris Meekins and Dr. Paul Gaston. And I am now thinking that there was a conspiracy because they put me up here after Dr. Angelo, and also because my PowerPoint is not working. But I will recall what she said. I am a human being, and nothing human can be alien to me. When Louisa and Israel Smith got married on December 25th, 1856, perhaps they dreamed of one day being free to live and to love, and to raise a family that could not be separated by slaveholders' desires or a need by slaveholder to raise some ready cash, or the division of an estate in the event of death, or just plain capriciousness or a mean streak that set him off one day and resulted in a father, a daughter, a wife, or a mother being sold away. Such optimism on the part of Louisa and Israel Smith would not have been totally unreasonable, given the unprecedented escalation of the conflict over slavery in the 1850s. Still, this couple could not have predicted what would come, that in a few years the nation would be at war and that they would play a part in the outcome. Israel would become a soldier in the 47th U.S. Army, and Louisa would become a laundress for a black regimental company. But first, Louisa and Israel had to get to freedom. First, they had to translate President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation on the ground. They had to do what the president had asked black people to do on September 22nd, 1862. He told them you have to, quote, make your own actual freedom, end quote. Together, Louisa and Israel Smith joined other enslaved couples, some with children and elderly parents, from throughout the war-torn Mississippi Valley. They placed their bet on the proclamation, and they headed for Union lines to make their actual freedom. All across the South, thousands of enslaved people were doing the same thing, or where conditions were different, as they were in the South Carolina Sea Islands. They were making freedom where they stood. My talk today focuses on what the work of making actual freedom looked like in the Mississippi Valley, and the ways in which it differed for men and women. For enslaved people like Isaac and Louisa, who lived in the upper Mississippi River Valley, getting to freedom meant literally going down the river. Their journey would take them first from a plantation in northeast Mississippi, south to the heart of Louisiana's cotton-producing empire. Measured in mere miles, only 40, it was a short journey. Measured in political terms, it was a world away. They, along with others from their plantation, got away barely a step ahead of their master, who then took the rest of his slaves and fled to Texas. In the world to which Louisa and Israel fled, not only were they free by the terms of the Emancipation Proclamation, but that freedom, at least they believed, would be bolstered by the presence of the U.S. Army. There they would find safe refuge, a new world in the making. Louisa and Israel, along with Thomas Paine and the Johnson sisters, Louisa and Melinda, all hailed from the same Lake Washington, Mississippi plantation. They had been, quote, raised together, had known each other since they were, quote, small children, they said. But the road to freedom would take them along different gendered paths. At some point after leaving the plantation, a Union gunboat picked them up, and from there, their lives diverged sharply. The men were taken to Lake Providence, Louisiana, and enlisted in the Army By this point, in the spring of '63, Lake Providence was a major recruiting station for black soldiers. But before the boat reached Lake Providence, it stopped, and it emptied itself of women and children. It ordered the women and children off the boat at another place called Goodrich's Landing, some 15 to 20 miles south of Lake Providence. Goodrich's Landing had recently been a major staging area for General Grant and his campaign to take Vicksburg. On orders from Louisiana Governor Thomas More, thousands of bales of cotton along the levees in this area had been burned, and the burning had gone on for days. So it was the burning, it was the movement of armies, all of which, including the flight of slaveholders, helped to pave the way for the flight of enslaved people like the ones that I'm studying. Their flight had gained momentum in March of 1863 when Adjutant General Lorenzo Thomas arrived with orders from the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, to put some teeth in the recruitment of black men in the Mississippi Valley. So all through this region in the Upper Valley, in counties and parishes like Carroll, Tensas, in areas like Lake Providence and Milliken's Bend and Goodrich's Landing in Louisiana, this area would become home to an ever-growing population of women and children separated from their husbands and fathers who were either enlisted in the Army or who were working as military laborers. And at some point, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about here, at one point in 1863, there were some 50,000 black women and children located at just this one place. And there were no houses, no tents, they were just on the river. Among the things we learned to appreciate from the story of black women refugees in the Mississippi Valley are the ways in which it resembles refugee life in our own time. In the U.S. Civil War, as today, refugees were the product of a war that provoked a humanitarian crisis. Poor provisions of sanitation and housing made for an increasingly disease-ridden environment, more deadly than ever in the camps populated by women and children strewn along the Mississippi River and nearby towns. I want to focus here, though, on two less appreciated aspects of black refugee life: the violence at its center and its peripatetic nature. Historians have focused a great deal of attention on the so-called contraband camps. One of the unintentional, I'm not sure, results is a rather static portrait of the lives of the men, the women, and the children who ran, who escaped the South's farms, plantations, industries, towns, and cities. The most common approach to telling the story notes their flight, and it notes the general hardships they faced in the camps. Attention focuses, moreover, on camps in areas where there was the least military conflict, places like Freedman's Village in Virginia and the Sea Islands, for example. What we miss, then, is the critical story of how black women refugees came to be at a particular place. What we miss is the temporary and unsettled nature of many of the camps. What we miss are the ongoing migrations. Thousands of black women would see their lives uprooted over and over again. Sometimes these migrations were tied to changing battlefield plans. If Grant had to move his army, that might require moving refugees near him. On March 31st, 1863, for example, refugee camps at Cairo and Columbus were ordered broken up, and the people transferred to an island in the Mississippi River, in that particular case, island number 10. For these people, it was a move back to the South. For thousands, tens of thousands of black women and children, life as refugees meant constant movement. The movement, however, was not simply a matter of their being ordered to move, though that was a big part of the story. Sometimes they initiated the migrations. To be sure, the latter was conditioned by the larger war, but it's also clear that what people at the time called the wandering of black people, the roaming, the roving about, ascribed to refugees, often by white observers in the way of racist caricature, spoke to the continued efforts of these people to probe freedom's meanings, its boundaries, and to make it happen. The initial migrations to Union lines were, for many, but the first of a series of migrations, none of which constituted aimless roaming or wandering. To go back to Louisa Smith, for example, when her husband was taken to Lake Providence and enlisted in the 47th, she and other women were taken to Goodrich's Landing. There at Goodrich's Landing, Louisa joined others who had made their way independently, and residents of the landing. There were about 15 plantations on that landing, so there was already some people there. The women were put to work on U.S. government-sponsored plantations. Louisa apparently decided to stay here, and with some support from her husband, who made it clear that he did not want her to be anywhere near an army camp because of the things that were going on there. No doubt, Israel was worried about what he saw in these places of the treatment of black women. No doubt he was also worried about the constant changes in Union policy, the ability of commanders here and there to order black women out of camp whenever they felt like it seemed. General Lorenzo Thomas's decision when he first arrived in the valley was to deny black women refuge within Union lines, where they might have been near their male kin. But Louisa Smith did, nevertheless, even though her husband said, you can't stay where I am, it's too dangerous, she did move about the area. She traveled to visit Israel in camp, and when he became ill, as so many of the soldiers and the refugees did, she would go and help nurse him when he was in the military regimental hospital at Snyder's Bluff. There he would die of dysentery, as so many of the soldiers did, less than 2 months after he enlisted. Louisa stayed on at Goodrich's Landing after her husband died. She was there for about a year before she made her way to Jackson, and it's still during the war, where she got a job as a military laundress. But understanding the year she spent at Goodrich's Landing helps us to better understand the lives of black women refugees. By the time she arrived at Goodrich's Landing, it was host, as I mentioned, to a federal labor encampment on plantations confiscated by the government and quite vulnerable to Confederate attack. It was also a place where black women had begun to reconstitute family and community ties and build new networks of friendship and kin. Their movements also reveal a familiarity with the rivers and the swamps of the region, the product and part of what Walter Johnson in River of Dark Dreams calls the counterculture of the Cotton Kingdom. The steamboat economy, Johnson argues, allowed black people to, quote, daily reproduce the networks of affiliation and solidarity that made it possible for them to escape slavery, end quote. It was that steamboat economy that made it possible for Cynthia Hobson, for example, in the midst of the Civil War in April of 1863, to not only follow the Union soldiers to freedom, but to get herself a job on the steamer Hannibal. When the Hannibal arrived at Vicksburg on the day that Vicksburg surrendered to Union forces, she left the boat and took up residence in Vicksburg, and she was still in Vicksburg in 1901. At Goodrich's Landing, black women and girls, I say parenthetically in the nomenclature we use to talk about slaves and free people, the category girls generally disappears. They're women, men, and children, but we need also to talk about young teenagers. Cynthia Hobson was a teenager. She was only 14 when she fled by herself and got a job on the Hannibal. She too reproduced these networks that had begun in slavery. And I should add that these networks would stand them in good stead in the decades to come. In the absence of her husband, Louisa reconstituted, along with the other women, and nourished ties with each other. Louisa, for example, nourished ties with women who had come from her plantation, women who had been owned by the same master, and women who had come from a nearby plantation he owned, but they were two separate plantations, women like Emmeline Anderson. Emmeline Anderson found employment also as a laundress and a cook for one of the black regimental companies. She left, she was also at Goodrich's Landing, but she would leave the landing before Louisa. Yet she would go back. That is, Emmeline would go back to the landing frequently. She would go back there to see her friends and acquaintances. And she would go back, she said, she'd go back and forward from the regiment, as she put it, to visit and as a courier between black soldiers and their wives and children. She carried notes and money from the soldiers to their wives and vice versa. Letitia Taylor, who had belonged to a slaveholder in a nearby plantation close to the one these other women lived on, was also in their midst. Taylor was at the landing, and Emmeline Anderson would recall that she met Taylor and her husband, quote, up the Mississippi River, where they were gathering up colored men to make soldiers of them near Lake Providence, end quote. When her husband joined the army, Letitia stayed behind at the landing. The women, girls, and children who are the subjects of my work lived in places that became sites of some of the war's worst civilian atrocities. It made a great deal of difference whether an enslaved woman or child ended up in a camp in Washington, D.C., or Arlington, Virginia, or a camp on the banks of the Mississippi River. The decision to allow the enlistment of black men in Union forces fueled liberation, but it did so unevenly and with repercussions that were felt differently in different places. Soldiering carried black men away from their families, but enslaved men could not leave their families, quote unquote, at home like white soldiers could. They did not leave hoping their wives, mothers, and sisters would be able to carry on the farm or the home in their absence, and all the while provide moral support and material support. Enslaved men left hoping to return for their families, or they moved to Union lines with their families by their side. By the spring of 1863, tens of thousands of enslaved people had taken advantage of the chaos of war and the promise of freedom embedded in the proclamation to flee the plantations in the valley. Overwhelming, still developing, and often incoherent Union policies for refugees. But just as the Union advanced to take Vicksburg, assisted black people in their flight, it also placed them in danger. In the late spring and summer of 1863, Confederate military attacks along a broad swath of the valley, from Lake Providence down to Goodrich's Landing, devastated black women in these camps and the camps themselves, proving once again that the path to freedom was full of risk and danger, proving once again the ways in which the war gendered freedom's coming. Over the past 2 decades, historians have begun to explore in rich detail the unevenness of freedom's arrival, its precariousness, and its protracted nature, yet far too little of this work has foregrounded the story of enslaved women and children who ran to Union lines, or explored what happened to them, to women like Louisa. In fact, Louisa barely escaped death and re-enslavement when, as she later recalled, at Goodrich's Landing, quote, the rebels came and they captured some colored people and took them off, end quote. The others scattered, she said. She was among those who scattered. They had also witnessed these people who were at Goodrich's Landing. And some of them had also witnessed the Confederate forces hang and dissect a black man who had tried or was accused of assisting the Union forces at Deer Creek, Mississippi. In the attack that Louisa referenced at Goodrich's Landing, Confederate cavalry and artillery burned the refugees out. Some were left to die in the flames. 1,200 were captured and returned to slavery. Arriving on the scene the morning after the attack, Union Colonel Samuel Naismith was shocked by what he found, and he wondered how such a thing could happen in what he called, in quote, a civilized nation. He found, he wrote, a degree, quote, of atrocity such as has no parallel in civilized or savage warfare, end quote. He found women and children who had been massacred. He reported in nauseating detail what he found, including the charred remains of the dead. This massacre at Goodrich's Landing was neither the first nor would it be the last attack on government-sponsored labor camps along the Mississippi River. 2 weeks prior to the attack, a unit of Texas Cavalry had attacked at Milliken's Bend and captured 150. That raid had been preceded by a few days of raid at Lake St. Joseph in Tensas Parish, where Grant had his base in the winter of 1862-63. The June raids were just the latest in a long series of blows the refugees had suffered. Severe destitution and starving times had also surfaced at Milliken's Bend, where efforts on the part of black women to get passes that would allow them to go through Union lines to take work as laundresses had been rebuffed, where General T.W. Sherman had offered that the more desirable option was simply to get rid of them completely. The month of June had seen attacks at Plaquemine, Louisiana, at Mound Plantation and Donaldsonville. Some of their proceedings, wrote one Union officer, were too atrocious to be believed. Even Confederate commanders reported the atrocities and sometimes celebrated them. In his report of July 10, 1863, Confederate Commander General J.G. Walker wrote that since the date of my last report, the forces under my command have broken up plantations engaged in raising cotton from Milliken's Bend to Lake Providence, and we've captured some 2,000 Negroes and restored them to their masters. In all of this time, as people were dying in the Mississippi Valley, scattered reports were trickling back up to the nation's capital. Reports by missionaries who were gradually coming to the valley much later than they had to, say, the Sea Islands, Freedmen's Aid Societies, by reporters like the New York Times reporter who wrote on the raid at Milliken's Bend. But too often these reports were so incomplete. The New York Times report, for example, on the raid at Milliken's Bend, concluded that the Confederate attack had been a small thing. It was not serious, the reporter wrote, even though he included this fact that to his knowledge, at least 150 women and children had been captured, but still it wasn't a serious affair. Lorenzo Thomas himself, in his report in October of 1863 to Secretary of War Stanton, focused on not the loss of black life, but on the impact the raids would have on the men running the plantations who were trying to make some money from cotton. He noted that the attack at Milliken's Bend had driven off many of the Negroes, yet he maintained that the Confederates had been signally defeated, even though they had killed and taken off many of the refugees. Thomas was concerned mainly with collecting the scattered hands that Louisa had talked about and returning them to work on the government labor camps. He said not a word in his report that was reprinted in the New York Times about the devastation that had taken place there. To the end of the war, the efforts of black women and children to build new lives in freedom were also undermined not only by the movement of troops, by Confederate scouts and cavalry raids, but also by nature, by flooding, for example. And my images aren't working, but One of the images that I had to show is one that I think really captures the story that I'm trying to tell. And it's an image of a refugee camp. We have very few images of refugee camps. We have images of so-called contraband camps. This is a refugee camp that was at Helena, Arkansas. And this image, what it does is that it restores to our historical imagination, in addition to the historical record, a visual record or image of the social and the environmental disaster that made these refugee camps the site of the wars, or helped make them the site of the war's most sustained humanitarian crisis. In this image, for example, and I can just briefly describe the images of children and women in a very dilapidated camp, that if you saw it, it would remind you of refugee camps that we see today. It commands our attention in the way in which it forces us to confront the reality of refugee camps in American history in the Civil War. It allows us to see in the 19th century United States the phenomena that we associate with the 20th century or the 21st century, or something that happens to people in other places. It places the history of the women that I'm studying and the places that they lived and the atrocities associated with them, not only in an unfamiliar place, but antecedent to its later modern reincarnation in places like Cuba, the Philippines, and the American West. We would do well to remember that Civil War commentators, newspaper correspondents, U.S. Sanitary Commission commissioners, government agents, soldiers, and military commanders called places like this refugee camps, not contraband camps. This image makes it clear why they did. For most Americans, even today, images of death and dying in sordid camps like the POW camp at Andersonville speak to the hardships suffered by soldiers, not civilians. To the extent that civilian suffering figures in contemporary thinking about the larger, among the larger public and even among scholars, it is generally framed within the visual and narrative lens that takes little account of refugees or refugee camps. Rather, the lens focus, when it is focused on refugees, is on white refugees. It's on plantation ruins. It's on narratives about scarcity on the home front or guerrilla warfare that targeted white women and children. To be sure, in this moment of an ongoing Civil War sesquicentennial, we have made progress in making sites of black suffering, such as the battlefields on which black soldiers fell, and the camps, more familiar to the general public. Yet it remains the case that we seldom associate suffering in the Civil War, death in the Civil War, or destruction in the Civil War with enslaved women and children, nor the camps in which they lived and died as somehow part of the story about the war's human toll. For one group of people in one camp, the image makes clear the toll was manifold. And first in this image, you see the children, the most vulnerable of non-combatants in wartime. And initially, when I saw the image, it seemed to me that the photographer, one of the lesser-known Civil War photographers, intended that the image, that the children would be the primary focus of the image. And then the more I looked at it, the more I was not sure. The children dominate the foreground, together with a woman holding a baby who sits on the ground in their midst. And along the front of these dilapidated makeshift cabins with no windows or proper doors, sit women, other women, adult women. But the photograph is clearly staged. It's neither a random shot, nor taken on a random day. Everyone is dressed up. And I think more and more about it. Could it be possible that in their flight from freedom, these people had found sanctuary, if not freedom? When they arrived, these people who are now dressed up in these nice clothing would have come in rags. What clothing they had on would have been fatigued by as much as 2 years of war. For most slaves in the Mississippi Valley, the annual allotments of clothing had long stopped. Some would have arrived virtually naked, but here they are in an image outfitted in fancy attire. Shoeless boys sport nice jackets, vests, and even ties. Some wear full suits. The women no longer in what's often described as the narrow short dresses with no crinoline or underwear beneath them, are attired in dresses that cover the arms and legs and have fresh aprons on. But the new clothing, I know, has come in boxes from the Midwest and the Northeast, collected by the U.S. Sanitary Commission. And at Helena, where this picture is taken, its sole female agent, Maria Mann, from the famous Mann family. Mann's letters have told me a lot about this place and this camp. They chronicle the work of gathering food and clothing, the appeals made back home to family and friends for help. So if Banks, the photographer, intended to present a positive image of Black refugee life by dressing these people up, the landscape in which they are presented cannot be dressed up. It's a landscape of refusal. Whether he intended it or not, this landscape commands the scene. It overpowers everything else, from the starkness of the thin crop of trees behind the cabins to the cabins or shanties themselves. The shanties give voice to unimaginable loss. In the planks of varied size and in the gaping holes between them, the windows without panes. In the ramshackle side porches visible in the upper right-hand corner, designed perhaps to afford some respite from cold and heat and rain and snow. In all the telltale signs of hurried and haphazard construction, I see a refugee camp, not a contraband camp. The well-dressed refugees cannot conceal the squalor around them, the quarters devoid of comfort or decency. In the image, we cannot see directly the vector-borne diseases, but we can see them indirectly, carried by rotten meat and blood-sucking mosquitoes and fleas and lice and biting flies and mites and ticks. We can't see the malaria and the typhoid fever, the chronic diarrhea and dysentery, the death from exposure. We cannot see the animal carcasses that cover the ground nearby, nor how the cold and snows of February 1863 had penetrated the gaping holes in the shanty walls and the open spaces that counted for windows. The floors made of dirt, which made a muddy, diseased mess of things. We cannot see how the subsequent floods had contributed to making Helena, in Mann's words, a sickly, crowded post. She documented the carcasses, the filth, the decay, the miscarriages suffered by Black women, the babies orphaned when their mothers succumbed to disease, and those who died alongside their mothers. Those who arrived sick already, one mother pregnant with 2 young children, ages 6 and 2, died soon after she arrived, and her 2-year-old died soon after. Another came with her husband, who intended to enlist in the U.S. Army. He died within a week, and she came down with smallpox. I don't know what happened to their children, but the children in the photograph no doubt included many orphans. After weeks of planning their escape, or perhaps only days, enslaved people who made it to Helena or to similar refugee camps after Union occupation initially thought perhaps they had reason to celebrate and reason to fight to survive. They had made it through territory patrolled by Confederate soldiers. They had endured hunger. Sometimes they had left loved ones behind or friends. They had seen traveling companions fall by the wayside, laid low by exhaustion, hunger, or disease, or Confederate scouts or guerrilla forces. Those who made their way to Goodrich's Landing or to Helena had come in small groups and large groups, and some alone. They had come as soldiers' wives, as families, as fiancés and lovers who followed their men to Helena and other places. For most, the belief that the Union lines offered the best hope for freedom and protection against angry slaveholders in the Confederate Army was a major motivating factor. but like our refugee camps that became gathering places for black people during the war, this one, or these at Helena and Goodrich's Landing, were at once places of despair and death and places of refuge and hope. There were sites in either case of the making of freedom. So it was that in a place like Helena, in the spring of 1863, former slave Sally Williams and William Anderson got married in the camp of the 46th U.S. Colored Infantry at Helena, just days after the 1st Regiment Infantry Arkansas Volunteers of Black Arkansas Regiment was organized. Sally Anderson was among the more fortunate. After she married, she was hired as a laundress for her husband's regiment, and so she could draw rations. The most desperate of these women had come to Helena to die. They came, they said, to die even in quasi-freedom in the camps, that was preferable to dying in slavery on the plantations. Maria Mann said, they come here to die, and they do die very rapidly. Images and narratives about black women refugees and refugee camps fill an important void in our understanding of the Civil War. They speak to the absences and the typical images of contraband camps, so-called. They raise new questions and open up new lines of inquiry. They make it possible for us to see the coming of freedom from a different angle, one that affected tens of thousands of black women and children and the elderly. It makes it possible for us to see things differently. When Alexander Gardner set up his shop in Washington, D.C. in 1862 in competition with his former employer, the more famous photographer Matthew Brady, Gardner placed two big signs advertising his new business over the front and side of his new business. The largest sign read, quote, "Views of the War." This photograph from Helena adds to that well-used moniker, "A view of the war rarely photographed." Thank you.